Dr. Jordan Marshall. He is, as it says, a professor of plant biology here at Purdue. He got his bachelor's degree from Ball State. He got his master's degree from Michigan Technological University, and he got his PhD from the University of Tennessee. And his main interest is in the invasive species and disruptive things. So this is a good time with the way everything is going for us to have Dr. Marshall. So.
All right, so I'm Jordan Marshall. I'm a professor here at Purdue Fort Wayne. Like I said, I've been here since 2010, and I study forests, but I also study sand dunes and plant communities and how plant communities change in sand dunes, how they change in forests, invasive species, disturbance and succession within forests, and a whole range of other kind of ecological kind of questions related to forest structure and organization and how communities of plants kind of move and change through time. I always like to say that forest ecology is in my academic genealogy. So my PhD advisor wrote the textbook Forest Ecology with his PhD advisor. So it's basically going back multiple generations of PhD advisors to kind of get to me, who studies forests. And like Pam said, I went to Michigan Tech and did some stuff in sand dunes up there, and then I went to University of Tennessee and did studied hardwood forests there. And when I got here, I kind of did both, or I'm doing both. I study sand dunes in Michigan and then also hardwood forests around here. So today we're going to talk about kind of history of forests in Indiana, thinking about where they came from and what's there, the ecology of how things kind of interact, and then maybe a little discussion about where forests are going to go in the future for the state. So with that, what is a forest? Bunch of trees. Without looking at the notes in front of you? Yeah. Multiple layers, decent size. So a bunch of trees. In reality, it's a three-dimensional ecosystem. It's a complex layer of plants and time and space that are all creating this functioning unit. So we're going to think about forests as a living unit, as its own species at times, because it's so interconnected and functioning together as a group that the forest itself often functions as a living organism itself. And we got multiple layers. We're going to have overstory, which are the trees at the top that are shading everything below. We're going to have midstory, that's going to be sometimes dense, sometimes it's really thin. If you go into forest in Indiana, sometimes there's nothing in the midstory. There's just no shrubs, there's just nothing there. And it's just the nature of how our forests develop over the last 80 years or 100 years since they were cut last. And then we have understory. That's where the wildflowers are. That's where the tree seedlings are. That's where the shrubs that are coming up are. And all those layers are really important. And we're going to have in-between layers. So what we think about the mid-story, there's going to be things just above that. That's the trees that are getting ready to become the overstory. There's going to be this movement vertically of trees. And again, my research is about how plants move and how they reorganize. And you don't often think about plants moving. You think about seeds moving, but the plants themselves are going to move vertically. They're going to get recruited up into larger size classes. They're going to move up through the layers. And that's a really important process when it comes to how forests develop and change, is that we have an understory that establishes, and then the trees get recruited up into larger and larger size classes. And then we have multiple communities. We've got communities that are the trees themselves, the shrubs in the mid-story. We've got wildflowers in the understory. We've got salamanders. We've got birds. We've got insects. We've got everything that is making up all of the living component of this forest. So the important thing is that we are talking about something more than just a bunch of trees. The forest exists because of what the trees create, but it exists as a forest because of everything else that's there. And so it's all the layers, it's all the communities, it's all of the non-living parts of the forest, because we're going to have soil that's non-living parts or has non-living parts. We have water, we have the atmosphere around it, we have the climate that's surrounding that forest. Everything is interacting to make that forest what it is. So here we've got a mixed forest. And you can see the mixture because the conifers are still green. The hardwood trees have started losing or changing colors. And so looking at this, we oftentimes think about the forest as this continuous unit of trees. But we're going to have mixtures of stands. So stand is a group of trees that has some connection. They may be all the same species. They may be connected through age, they may be connected through something, but a stand has some sort of boundary within the forest. And oftentimes whenever we do management or make decisions about how we're going to control what's happening in a forest, we think about the stands as the units within the forest and make decisions at the stand level that's impacting the entire forest. Especially when it's a big forest, when it's something that's really large and everything's interacting and connected, it's really hard to manage a large property without thinking about the individual stands.
When you're looking at that picture,
Yeah.
what are the stands?
So there may be, this front section here may be conifers and hardwood mix, but as you move back, there may be some areas where as you go up on a ridge, you start transitioning into oaks. And so there may be a stand of oaks, and then down in the valley may be maples. The conifers may be kind of grouped together, and this may be one section where it's mixed conifer and hardwoods, and there may be sections where it's just conifers. And so that really, it's really nebulous and gray on how you define a stand, because everything's going to be connected, but you're trying to find units that are a little bit more independent than connected. So you kind of draw boundaries that are just ambiguous sometimes. And as we move down into the forest, we get different layering. Again, we have overstory trees, and I'm going to trip over this wire every time. Overstory trees, we've got mid-story trees recruiting up, and then down below we've got little bitty understory trees that are just getting started. And as time progresses, those overstory trees are going to start getting old. And the interesting thing about trees is that for most trees, they have size-defined mortality, and they have less age-defined mortality. So at a certain point, trees get so big that they can't move water effectively up the stem from the roots, and they can't move sugars effectively down from the leaves to the roots. And eventually they start to starve, or they start to dehydrate, and eventually they die. It's not really associated with age, but it's much more associated with size. So as these trees get really, really big, and their diameters get so big that they just can't continue to grow, they eventually die, gaps form, trees get recruited up into that space. And there's a whole area of forest ecology that is gap dynamics and and canopy dynamics, and how gaps open in the forest canopy, and then how things move up into that space. And then we also have forests like this. Where is the forest in this photo? Who can guess where the forest is in this photo? All of it. So again, we have to keep in mind that it's everything together that makes a forest. And so the reason that we have the little ones in the foreground is because there was tall overstory forest in the foreground at some point. And it was harvested. It was removed. And what's come up is the regeneration. It's the seedlings that are coming up after the forest has been removed. It's still forest. Doesn't matter how big the trees are, it's still a forest. Because the trees are creating this vertical space, even though they're short, they're defining the vertical space of that ecosystem. The soils are all determined because of what forest was there before. And the trees that are there coming up now are determined from what was there before. And so it was a forest before, we cut it down and remove it, it's still a forest. Because it wants to function as a forest. It quote unquote, wants to be a forest. And so it's going to become a forest again. And so when we do these kind of cuts, again, that would have been a stand level cut. And so the definition by a manager would have been, here's the boundary that we're cutting, and this is now a stand that's been removed. The stand behind it was left, and there's rotation that basically goes through and allows this to get reestablished before doing any other kind of management in the area. Yeah?
Would they have seeded or planted?
Possibly. I don't know where I forget where this photo came from, but they possibly could have. That could have been seed that was just left behind in the soil. I'm not sure. And they could have came in and planted pines. Not necessarily, because it's a lot of pines, so this could have been in the Carolinas. And so they could have planted pines, or it could have reseeded as pines. I forget where this photo came from. But yeah, they could have seeded, they could have planted, it could be natural regeneration. It's a whole range of things it could have been. Is that a forest? Okay. So we can't forget and fail to see the forest for the trees. Basically, the idea is that it's everything encompassing the forest in terms of living and non-living things that create the forest. The trees are just defining the three-dimensional space. Everything else is defined by the animals, the plants that are there other than trees. And so even though this is rows of aspens, it's still a forest. It's just an artificial forest. And so wildlife are still going to use this similarly to a natural aspen grove. The difference is everything's in straight rows and lines. All right. So some important things that we're going to keep talking about over and over, and I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page definition-wise. The first one is a population. And so anytime I'm using the word population or you read the word population, we're thinking about a group of organisms, all the same species. So we're talking about a population of sugar maple, or we're talking about a population of white-tailed deer. So they're in a particular area and they have the ability to mate. So if we're thinking about box turtles, the population may be geographically relatively small, depends on how far box turtles move and migrate. For sugar maple, it may be farther because they're pollinating by the wind. But it doesn't matter how big the geographic area is. If they're in the same area, have the ability to mate, and they're the same species, they're of the same population. So here we've got a photo of beech. Actually, those are probably red maples. They may be red maples or beech. It's kind of hard to tell without the leaves. But the idea here is that all those stems are the same species, so they're part of the same population because geographically, spatially, they're relatively close to each other. They have the ability to reproduce and mate. And so those are all one species or one population of the same species. When we talk about communities, we're thinking about things that are grouped together, living in the same area, have the ability to interact, but are of different species. So now we can think about all of the trees as a community that include beech, American beech, sugar maple, yellow poplar, hackberry, all together as part of the forest community of trees. It can be the shrubs. We could look at the native shrubs and think about black haw and spicebush and forming our mid-story layer and defining the community of native shrubs. We could also think about it as the community of birds. So all the different species of birds that are using this forest. But the important thing is that it's all the groups of a, usually we limit to a taxonomic kind of level. So we might say all the plants. We could have a community of plants. So like I said, my research is on plants, but I study trees, I study shrubs, I study city. It's not even that far out of the city. It's not really wilderness. When you get to Indiana, it's wilderness. And it's nothing like any of the European settlers would have wanted. All right, so then the first land office opened in Vincennes in 1807. What does a land office do, especially in the frontier? Sells land. It basically allows people to take claim, to buy land, and then what are they going to do with it?
Farm it.
They're going to homestead it, they're going to farm it. How do you farm within a forest? You need to cut down all the trees, which is why our seal has not only the bison, but then has the guy cutting down the tree for the field. What's that?
The Indiana bison are extinct. They were their own species.
All right, thank you. So we have the bison that's now extinct, and the trees that are being cut down because of agriculture in the background. All these are standing row crop behind there. So by 1810, the population was 24,000 people. 10 years later, 147,000 people. So the frontier has moved, and we now have this mass immigration into Indiana that's going to continue for decades. By 1870, some of these numbers don't quite add up because they're from different sources, but by 1870, 2/3 of the entire forests of Indiana were cut. Between 1800 and 1870, it was roughly 705 acres per day. So that if you calculate out the 705 acres per day, it ends up being closer to 70% of the forest, and not actually it's like 75% of the forest. But this other resource said 2/3. It's hard to tell because there would have been planting also happen, or trees regenerating also. But it was a lot of acreage cut, right?
Square mile.
What's that?
That's a square mile.
A square mile every day. Chainsaws? Cross-cut saws? Axes. So even though there were cross-cut saws in existence, most of the forest being cut were with axes. So modern cross-cut saws didn't really get into forestry management until about 1880. So for 70 years there, it's just constant axe and cutting down of trees. So forested land between 1800 and 1900, 18 million acres cut, essentially. But at 1900, Indiana is the leading hardwood producer. Like we are in the nation, we are outputting more hardwood products than any other state. So 700 million board feet of oak and 11 million board feet of walnut, just pumping out of Indiana. And that was for that 1 year. For 1900, we were the leading hardwood producer. We were not the leading hardwood producer in 1901. We were not the leading hardwood producer in 1899. It was 1900. We were the leading producer of hardwoods. Because by at the end of 1900, we have 1.5 million acres. So 8% of the state was still forested. And that's it. 1917 and 1920, we see a little fluctuation. We get a little bit of increase in acres of forest, but not much. A little down millions of acres to 1.4 million acres. And then in 1921, we have the Classified Forest Act. Does anybody know what the Classified Forest Act was in 1921?
They decided what was a forest and it had to be preserved.
Okay. defining what was a forest and what needed to be preserved. What else? Anybody else know?
Set aside for taxing purposes.
Yeah, so essentially it's a way to set aside forest for tax incentives, and so it was a way to not preserve the forest, but allow there to be forest more so than there was before. Another 47 years later, we've got 3.9 million acres. So basically between 1900 and 1967, we have a doubling of the forest in Indiana. And this growth here happens because of the Classified Forest Act. Basically, foresters are going out and basically defining forests, which allows for tax incentives, allows for some preservation, protection of those forests by landowners. So it's not necessarily the state protecting it, but the landowners are given incentive to protect those. So we had like Fogwell Nature Preserve. Who knows Fogwell Nature Preserve? Okay. So we have that classified, I think, in 1930, something like that. Charles Deem went in and classified that because he was with the DNR, and basically that preservation of Fogwell starts almost 100 years ago because of Classified Forest Act, and then Charles Deem going in and doing the classification for that forest, and basically the preservation begins then that long ago. Right now we're at about 4.8 million acres. So 21% of the state. We'll get little fluctuations over years. So I've been giving this presentation for about 10 years now, and there's been little tiny fluctuations. I don't expect that to ever jump up the way it did from 1921 to 1967. I don't think it's ever going to happen because of our land use right now. So I mean, if we look at the southern part of the state, you can see it's a lot more forest than the northern part of the state. Why do you think that is? Northern part's flatter, so it's a lot easier to do agriculture. It's a lot hillier down here. What's that big chunk right there? Yeah, there's a mixture of Yellowwood and Brown County and the Hoosiers all around through there. That square right there, does anybody know what that is? It was the Jefferson Proving Grounds, which is now...
Town State Park.
No, what's the name? It's a fish and wildlife area now, right?
Big Oak.
Big Oak, yeah, that's what it is now. But yeah, so that was protected because it was military. And so it was forest, and nobody was going to go in and cut it, so it stays forest now. So only 16% of our forests are in public holding. And so that's DNR, that's Forest, U.S. Forest Service in the Hoosier, it's DNR and Division of Forestry, and also state parks. The rest of that is private holding, including preservation by land trusts like acres, and then individual landowners. So all of that land that exists in Indiana, so the vast majority of the land that's forested in Indiana is privately held, which means management decisions to make more forests are limited to those 16% of public holdings, because DNR can only make decisions and management plans for their own properties. And so individual landowners are going to make decisions about how they manage their own forests. So we've got Allen County, we've got Wells County, and Adams County. You can see this was from a thesis from one of my grad students a few years ago. And you can see this is all the forests across these three counties, which is a splattering of forests because there's agriculture, there's Fort Wayne, and there are sections that are very little forest. There are extra sections that are more. I mean, if you drive south from Fort Wayne on Highway 1, every little dot of forest is in each farmer's field, they've got a forest area. And that's why it kind of makes this grid. And this, the thesis, my grad student was trying to answer the question of, trying to get to and answer a question about the function of forests at different sizes. And the idea of, does size matter when it comes to the forest? Is there a bottom limit where it no longer functions as a forest and is just a bunch of trees? And is there some limit that it has to reach size-wise in order to become a functional forest? And what we really found was that it was more the shape that played into the community. And so if it was a perfect square or it was a circle, it had lower numbers of species there. It had less tree regeneration. But if it had weird shapes, then our explanation was that basically it caught more stuff. So animals moving across the fields, if it's a weird shaped forest, they're going to run into it more likely, which means then they're bringing seeds with them, more likely getting things there. If it's wind blowing it across the field, an oddly shaped forest is going to catch more stuff than a perfectly round or a perfectly square forest. So it's kind of this idea that the edges mattered. Big blocks that we have in these three counties. What's right here? Because yeah, it's Wabash State Park. Right here.
No, it's Allen County.
It's Allen County.
Fox Island?
It's Fox Island. Yeah. Well, yeah, I know. It's still forest. It just doesn't have the big trees, but it's still forest. What's that big connection right there?
Cedar Creek.
Yeah, it's a Cedar Creek corridor. So we have these bigger forest sections in these three counties. They're really small if you think about how big they actually are compared to something like the Hoosier or even Big Oaks. These are our little dots up here. You can still see some river patterns that form of forest
There's the,
within the state.
there's the Wabash.
So where did the Indiana forests come from?
Glaciers brought the seeds in?
Glaciers, yes, but not the seeds.
Okay.
So yes, large portions of the state of Indiana were glaciated. Glaciers move, they bulldoze. They're scouring everything that was there in front of them. And so we had multiple glacial periods that came through, and basically much of what we see in the northern half of Indiana is remnants of the glacial passing and then recession. So it comes back to our idea that species have an environmental range that they can live in. There are conditions that they can live in. And once we go outside of those that shape of conditions, they can't exist there. And so all the forest plants have to move as the glacier proceeds in, because on the front edge of the glacier, it's going to be a climate that's unsuitable for most of the forests that would have been here. So they all have to move south. So they end up in Kentucky, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, into mountains in Tennessee as these refuges from the climate.